help but personally be reminded of David Gilmartin's 2015 review of Muslim Zion. And I quote, Devji explicitly proclaims as a virtue his own lack of interest in such politics, that is, in what actually happened in the run-up to Pakistan's creation. I am interested, he says, in the forms of argumentation and lines of reasoning that both transcend and survive such intentionality, by which he means the motives and intentions of groups and individuals to shape the prose of history. I'm sure all of us eagerly await for a critical examination of the motivations behind Professor Devji's altered perspective as preempted in today's title. Sir, it is a great pleasure and an honor to have you here with us today. With further ado, I therefore now hand over the proceedings to Dr. Faisal Devji. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Bipasha, for that generous introduction. I'll launch straight into the talk then and much look forward to the discussion that follows. Children, along with the mentally ill and prisoners in countries like the United States, are the only category of citizens disallowed from having a say in their own futures. That is to say, they are denied access to politics as a practice devoted by definition to making the future. But children are only the last of a number of such groups that had in the past been formally excluded from participation in political life. Not so long ago, they had kept company with slaves, women, the poor, illiterate, colonized, and religious or racial minorities of many kinds. And the reasons why children cannot be political actors remain the same as those that had prevented all these others from doing so. It is because they are not responsible for themselves that children cannot have a say in deciding both their own future and that of others. Now, such tautological arguments, once deployed against women, slaves, and others, are still used to keep children out of political life. These include their congenital immaturity, ignorance, dependence on others, vulnerability to outside influence, and inability to own or control property. Yet children are also at the center of politics insofar as it claims to make a future for them and even does so in their names. They also stand in for all the others who have been denied politics by reason of their racial, civilizational, or gendered childishness. And in this way, they differ from prisoners or the mentally ill, whose temporary status is otherwise so similar to that of children without being conceptually central to political thought. Children pose a unique problem for politics since they cannot consent to making the very future they are meant to represent. The global visibility of children in contemporary public life, from the environmental activist Greta Thunberg in Sweden to the advocate for girls' education Malala Yousafzai in Pakistan, may have been made possible by the internet and social media, but more importantly, it throws into relief the paradox of politics as an enterprise oriented to the future. The emergence of children into public life represents nothing more than the logical extension of politics itself as a practice in whose name universal claims have been made in modern times. Such claims were once and are still today made by women, slaves, or the colonized. But what does it mean for the future to speak for itself in the voices of children? How does their presence expose the limits of politics as a way of making this future? Now, childhood is not a natural, to say nothing of a biological category, one that can decisively be contrasted with adulthood. To reprise Rousseau's argument denying any difference between the physically weak and the strong, significant enough to justify the latter's political domination, we know that there will always be children more intelligent and responsible than some adults. And as demonstrated by the varying as well as changing age of sexual consent, voting, driving, or criminal responsibility the world over, childhood is also a notional and culturally defined category. It was invented in 18th century Europe as a distinct ontological and phenomenological state rather than a ritual or legal one defined by things like bodily control, sexual activity, or the right to enter into binding contracts. For the purposes of my argument, then, childhood refers not to any biological or even legal category, but serves as a rhetorical device to separate one world of action, responsibility, or experience from another. My particular concern is with the consequences of defining childhood by its inability to make a future. If children cannot participate in politics and speak for their future, adults must do so in their name and for a future they cannot share. This is why they represent children in political life as trustees, their acts meant to become altruistic, disinterested, and sacrificial in this respect, at least. It is this appeal to act against their own self-interest that characterizes the familiar invocations for adults to leave a better world for their children. Departing the conventional logic that would attribute all politics to the promotion of one's own interest, such an imperative diverts modern visions of political behavior into an older narrative of pastoral care. This had also characterized the trusteeship that free adult males once exercised on behalf of women and slaves, as well as the poor and colonized, thus showing how children not only represent the remnants of this past, but repeatedly bring it to the fore again. If adults are asked to sacrifice their own future for that of children, this both reinforces and in fact expands the future-oriented nature of politics, while at the same time depriving it of meaning as a form of self-interest. Interest being the fundamental unit of liberal and indeed modern politics. Of course, there can and will be attempts to reconcile these two kinds of futurity, but my point is that the child's very presence as a voiceless representative of the future compels the emergence of sacrificial politics as a trope, no matter how sincere or hypocritical it may otherwise be. Normally, it is only exceptional events like wars that provide the grounds for such a sacrifice, with childhood therefore departing their narrative by reason of its quotidian character. Here too, the child poses a significant limit to normative and liberal conceptions of political action. By entering politics as representatives of the future and thus occupying its conceptual center, children represent an adult status they have not yet achieved. They cannot, in other words, speak in their own name, but only in that of their future selves, something that globally prominent activists like Thunberg and Yousafzai routinely and deliberately do. Like the ghost of Christmas future in Charles Dickens's famous children's story, A Christmas Carol, the child in public life can only speak prospectively or spectrally from another time. There is always something of the occult about such figures who often serve as mediums for other people and other worlds. They do not and indeed cannot speak for themselves, but manifest some truth of which they may not themselves be aware, as familiarly expressed by the biblical idiom, out of the mouths of babes. In the astute and amusing diary of her travels in the US and Canada in 2019, Thunberg describes how important her childhood is for adults who seek a kind of oracular wisdom and moral chastisement from her, and I quote, "The same day I'm called to testify in the US Congress, but it just feels wrong. What am I supposed to do or say there? I want the people in power to listen to the science, not to me. And the fact that the responsibility to communicate them falls on me and other children should be seen for exactly what it is, a failure beyond all imagination." Close quote. Back in Europe, she's interviewed by a journalist who also expects a child's wisdom for her. Quote, "When I then start talking about carbon budgets, he gives up and interrupts. He knows very well he won't be able to use anything of what I'm now saying in his article. People want something simple and concrete, and they want me to be naive, angry, childish, and emotional. That is the story that sells and creates the most clicks. But, he continues, how are we going to solve this climate issue? Just the fact that this question is asked to me, a teenager, over and over is absurd, but not as absurd as the fact that the climate and ecological emergency is being reduced to a problem that needs to be fixed." Close quote. Now, there is another way in which children in public life become mediums, this time not for their future selves, but instead for their parents or other adults, and so the past. Child stars, among the earliest minors to lead extensive public lives without being either royal or divine personages, have become the stereotypical figures of such a vampiric mediation. The desire of parents to fulfill themselves through children is one way in which the profound political suspicion of illicit influence and exploitation manifests itself, one that has been used in the past to disqualify women, the illiterate, and the unpropertied from exercising agency in politics. It is no surprise, therefore, that all children in public life are inevitably seen by their critics as speaking in the voices of adults, either as victims or willing accomplices. Mediation is an ambiguous phenomenon which calls up ghosts from the past as much as the future. But gods and monarchs surely perform the same function, their ghostly legitimacy deriving from the past, but meant to be perpetuated into a future in which they will have themselves become spirits. Like children, such divine and royal figures are held hostage by these absent temporalities, such that their role in the present becomes a kind of interlude or threshold, one that calls for some great deed if it is not to crush its subject between past and future. And this provides yet another example of the way in which the child, in its very political deprivation, nevertheless continues to possess a certain connection to power, and so to pose an undefined threat to the very politics in which it apparently plays no part. Unlike women or slaves, whose politics is defined by the struggle to escape their status, children depend upon and even emphasize their lack of voice to become public figures. It is because children have no political status or voice in the present that they can serve as mediums in this way, alongside the equally voiceless animals who have traditionally functioned as occult familiars. The relationship between children and animals is based on their shared deprivation of language, which is one of the classical requirements defining humanity as much as politics. Of course, animals do not have a future in the sense that children are meant to, their status being permanent. And it is as purely present beings that they represent the conceptual limits of politics even better than children. Jacques Derrida is the theorist of spectrality as a way of thinking about the time of politics. His book, Spectres of Marx, begins with the famous invocation in the Communist Manifesto of a spectre haunting Europe. Like the child who might become its medium in politics, communism for Marx and Engels was a ghost from the future. But as Derrida reminds us in his subsequent discussion of the ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet, such specters and their demands emerge, in fact, from a time that is out of joint. Ghosts, in other words, represent not the past or future so much as the disruption of temporality itself, conceived as a linear progression, one whose fracturing allows different temporalities to seep into each other. And it is precisely the spectral role that children play in politics, their presence there always untimely and indicating a state of disruption. But what would it mean to set this time right, which Hamlet sees as being his cursed fate? Is the child meant to retreat to its speechless and so animal-like present by resigning the role of medium for a future self? Insofar as the visibility of children in political life signals a state of exception in some way, it by the same token ties them to the founding moment of all political regimes, which can be understood as the establishment of new ways of grasping the future. In this sense, they forestall, if not make possible, the exercise of sovereign power, whether revolutionary or reactionary, that Carl Schmitt famously described as a state of exception. And yet, as I have pointed out, children represent not simply exceptionality in politics, but also its permanent limit, if not contradiction. Their public presence thus indicates continuity as much as change. It is one thing for children to become the mediums of specters from the past or future, but how are we to describe the figure of the child itself as a ghost? For it is this possibility that children repeatedly raise in politics. They appear in public life to warn of the future's annihilation, as Greta Thunberg does so frequently when speaking about the destructive potential of climate change. And in doing so, they not only foretell, the destruction of their future selves, but become their prospective ghosts in the process. This is the role child ghosts play in literature, folklore, and film, defined as they are by the loss of their own futures. The child in politics is therefore haunted by the future in one way and by the past in another, while at the same time haunting the present by depriving it of meaning. This is clear in Thunberg's famous speech before the UN General Assembly in 2019, in which she speaks from and for different times as a witness to the future and its judgment upon the present. Quote, "This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today because these numbers are too uncomfortable, and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you." Close quote. Can the present possess political meaning without a future, or must it only have moral import of the sacrificial kind I described for adults who are asked to act on behalf of a future they will not share? Another way in which the deprivation of a future ends up depoliticizing the present has to do with a heedless, or more properly nihilistic, concern with momentary pleasure, or rather convenience, that Greta Thunberg inveighs against. Our refusal to act against global warming, like the possibility of nuclear annihilation whose apocalypse had preceded it in the popular imagination, suggests that we have accepted our doom, or at least that of our children at some level. And yet, apart from the ever-increasing tribe of billionaires who benefit from this crisis, our pleasures are too insubstantial to justify abandoning the future in this way. Thunberg's argument is that the politics we engage in is sacrificial in the wrong way, renouncing politics itself along with the future by refusing to take it seriously. Driven by habit, convenience, and sheer incapacity, while being shoved into the maw of the global economy, our politics has become a meaningless set of superstitions about the future, or gambles on it that are defined in purely economic terms. Against this, she suggests we have seen another kind of sacrifice for adults to engage in, yet one that is contradicted by Thunberg's simultaneous reliance on a political rationality motivated by the future. Her struggle is meant to rescue politics and so the future, though she can only do so by speaking as a child from outside its domain, while at the same time asking adults to sacrifice their own future, and so politics. The problem that the child as medium or ghost poses for politics is therefore twofold. On the one hand, children emerge in public life to speak for a threatened future which they would restore by the temporary suspension of a politics based on self-interest in the short term. In this way, they represent the exceptional moment of sovereignty in political founding. On the other hand, their advocacy of sacrifice presents a permanent and, as it were, structural threat to such a politics of the future. And this means that children stand in the way of the very sacrifice they encourage by representing the future. This is why they must suffer or sacrifice not in their own right, since they represent another time and stand outside politics, but by enacting the role that adults are expected to play in a vicarious or pedagogical performance. If it is not to become pure victimization, the suffering of children always entails their performance, or rather ghosting, of a politics that adults are otherwise meant to conduct. Malala Yousafzai not only endured an attempt on her life, but did so by taking upon herself the adult task of teaching girls as she herself would have liked to be taught. And in doing so, she short-circuited any linear relationship between past, present, and future. If a Thunberg or a Yousafzai wants to reclaim the future and so politics itself in a time that is out of joint, their contemporaries among the teenage jihadi brides who left Europe to join ISIS in Iraq and Syria appeared to be intent on risking, if not forsaking, theirs. Like their globally admired counterparts, these young women occupied two times and roles simultaneously, impersonating adults by embracing sexuality and violence, while yet remaining children in their apparently voluntary renunciation of political agency in the Islamic State. Like all children in public life, they were also suspected of being seduced or groomed by adults, or at least of consenting to their inveiglement in a way that put their status as victims into question. Can their actions also be associated with the sacrificial ones described above, which depend not upon renouncing the present for the future in the way of ordinary politics, but rather by doing so in the latter's absence? In their own view, these jihadi brides, to use the European media's salacious name for them, might well have been rushing into adulthood by sacrificing their own present for Islam's future, which seems to be the view taken by their countries of citizenship. Shamima Begum, for example, one of three young women from London who in 2015 left to join ISIS in Syria, was stripped of her citizenship, though she had been a minor when departing and is not known to have broken any British law. Yet it remains her childhood and sacrifice of the future it is meant to represent that gives Shamima Begum both her media allure and a genealogy going back to the Children's Crusade. By their sexualization, jihadi brides raise the issue of gender more clearly than some of the other children in politics. This was especially true of Shamima Begum, who had 3 children by the militant she was married off to, each one dying as she endured the rigors of war and imprisonment. The last died when she was fighting the British government's refusal to let her return to London, even if only to face trial. Her story also reminds us of the fact that women and children are bound together more closely than they are to slaves, prisoners, the poor, and others who had once been excluded from political life. As a child who became a woman to produce children for Islam, Shamima Begum literally embodied the gendered work that remains crucial to the making of childhood. But what other work does the coming together of the child and woman do? Greta Thunberg speaks of herself as a child in a generic and indeed conceptual fashion. Malala Yousafzai, on the other hand, was attacked by the Taliban because of her gender and apparent transvestitism in wanting to obtain a formal education. But whatever its cause, the large numbers of girls or young women to achieve visibility in public life merits attention. Does their gender allow such figures to double down on and dramatize the contrast between those who can and cannot act politically? Or does it display the child's link to an older world of associations? I suspect that gender here works to emphasize not the child's status as victim so much as a surprising power it exerts from outside politics and its typically masculine representatives. And in this way, women are pulled back to the world of children rather than representing their future adulthood and reproduction. One of the earliest children to receive global attention as an activist was Iqbal Masih, who, like Malala Yousafzai, was also from Pakistan. Surprisingly absent from the narrative of Yousafzai's life, given his similar fight for children to be in school rather than working long hours under duress, Masih had been put to work in a carpet weaving workshop at the age of 4 during the mid-1980s in order to pay off a loan by his impoverished parents, who I'm sure you will know were Dalit converts to Christianity in Pakistan. He managed to escape the brutal treatment meted out to him at the age of 10 on a second attempt and was helped by an organization dedicated to ending bonded labor. Masih then went to school and campaigned worldwide for the rights and education of children until he was shot dead at the age of 12, very likely by an assassin from the carpet weaving industry, which depended upon child labor. Masih spoke from a future he had already suffered, having been deprived of a childhood and so forced into adulthood before his time. As with Yousafzai, but not Thunberg, it was this experience that constituted what was adult about him. Like other children in politics, he had to play the role of child as well as adult while fighting to separate them in the lives of others. But unlike most of his peers, he invoked not the adult future of politics so much as the lost past of the child deprived of it and turned into a ghost. It should be clear by now that children from outside European and American societies, or at least from minority or non-white backgrounds, dominate the ranks of their peers in politics. Is this because non-Western societies are seen as being more violent in making victims and so untimely adults out of children? Or might it be the case that Greta Thunberg and others, including the children who followed her in striking for the cause of climate change at school, have inherited their curious role in politics from the erstwhile third world in theory, if not experience? The prospective politics of children in the West was on display in September 2020, when 4 Portuguese minors and 2 young adults took 33 countries to the European Court of Human Rights for their carbon emissions, as well as the climate impact their consumers and companies have on peoples elsewhere. The only situation that comes to mind of children in the West speaking from a notionally adult experience as activists rather than actual or potential victims was during 2018 in the aftermath of a series of school shootings in the US. These included protests, lie-ins, and a movement to have companies divest from the gun lobby represented by the National Rifle Association that mobilized hundreds of students and many schools under the sign of March for Our Lives and the National School Walkout. As with all American responses to school shootings, however, these could not be sustained. Yet it is only very recently that children in the West have been able to take on a public role of this kind, being confined previously to playing those of victims, entertainers, and with a longer genealogy, monarchs or fighting and martyred saints like Joan of Arc. In a familiar move, however, it is the European Thunberg who represents a universal and global cause for whose prosecution she must address politicians and people in the West. For as she makes clear in her speeches, it is they who are responsible for the climate crisis in both senses, as its primary perpetrators as well as potential opponents by reason of the wealth and power they possess. Her Asian peers, by way of contrast, speak to issues seen as being particular to the world beyond the West. And it is our inability to fit someone like Shamima Begum into either of these worlds that, apart from her association with the violence of the Islamic State, makes her such a difficult subject to deal with. For the threat of militant Islam is that it cannot be confined to specific groups of people or parts of the world, and so puts into question the division of the globe and its politics into universal and particular types. If the future and so politics speaks more urgently through children in the world outside the West, this may be due to the fact that since colonial times, such places have represented the sites of child marriage, child labor, and the loss of childhood more generally. Yet these children had in the past rarely escaped the status of victims and seldom played any role in politics apart from as an issue to be debated by adults. Something seems to have changed globally on this front, so that the experience of Iqbal Masih no longer served to define him only as a victim, but allowed him access to a knowledge otherwise reserved for adults. Such experience now produces a knowledge that politics is meant to prevent children from possessing, and in doing so of speaking from and for their future as adults. Perhaps it is the inability to demarcate separate realms for children and adults that has made this innovation possible outside the West. The child activist, in other words, desires to put down or transfer the burden of politics to others and is a self-canceling figure in this way. And yet these children also encourage each other to take on such roles, not least because their present-day representatives seem to understand that they cannot play these parts as adults and require successors to do so. In an essay contemplating her graduation from college and so looking back upon a childhood she can no longer claim, Malala Yousafzai describes this past as a time spent observing and judging the political failures of adults from the vantage point of someone unable to engage in politics. Yet this failure also resulted in the untimely experiences that fitted out her contemporaries and successors to take up adult burdens more effectively. Quote, yet we have long understood that a lot of work will fall on our shoulders. We watched while those in power failed to protect refugees and religious minorities, stop attacks on schools, ensure justice for Black and brown people, or even acknowledge that climate change exists. We have grown up knowing that the world we inherit will be broken. In many ways, we are more prepared for the current crisis because we have had a lot of practice fighting for change. I was 11 years old when I started advocating for girls' education in Pakistan, and 15 when the Taliban tried to kill me for speaking out. Close quote. The novel emergence of children in politics is not due to the loss of childhood in a compression of temporality made possible by some emergency, whether a civil war or natural disaster. Neither is it simply the consequence of social media and the making of a global audience with the triumph of neoliberalism after the Cold War. Crucial instead is the point I began this lecture with: the fact that children are the last remaining category of citizen barred from engaging in political life. This solitude has resulted from the universalization of modern politics, which is compelled to include more and more people into its logic, however hierarchically they may be situated within it. The instrumentality of such a politics based on making the future has also marginalized all other ways of claiming freedom, a role once played by religion as much as philosophy, to assume a near hegemonic power in social life. It is only in this situation that childhood assumes a new and negative power as the chief, if not only form of life and citizenship that lies outside the logic of politics. On the one hand, then, children threaten to join their former partners among women, slaves, or the conquered and colonized when they take on public roles that entail significant political consequences. But on the other hand, they can only do so by reinforcing their status as political outsiders, and in doing so, putting into question the very logic they would like to direct in support of some cause. The public lives of children, I have suggested, are given meaning by a kind of temporal refraction, in which they serve as occult mediums or even speak as ghosts in their own right. But the split in spectral subjects this produces for politics also presents it with an impasse. We have seen that one consequence of children speaking in the name of their adult selves is to stretch the future whose making defines politics so that it is no longer determined by the short-term projections of electoral cycles and even self-interest. This results in a sacrificial mode of parental action, whose trusteeship repudiates self-interest as a category because it sacrifices a permanent and structural condition rather than some temporary or emergency measure. Another consequence of the child's public life is the reversal of roles it makes possible. If it is children who must now represent the spirit of adulthood, then adults themselves have been turned into children in the process, there to take instruction on their true selves. Apart from fragmenting the political subject in this way, such a situation dispenses with its generational reality to make it a concept freed of biology. Greta Thunberg describes a number of such reversals in the diary of her trip to the US and back to Europe in 2019. She appears to be struck by the self-infantilizing character of American citizenship, whose insouciance about health and environmental concerns comes directly from corporate marketing and the image it sells of quotidian life in a democracy. Quote, who is the adult in the room? That question has been asked over and over again during the last year. But this question reaches a whole new level when I end up standing in front of the food court at the US House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. Fast food chains, hamburgers, candy and ice cream stores, Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin Robbins. Here you find the most powerful policymakers in the world sitting in their suits while drinking pink milkshake, eating junk food and candy. Close quote. It is as if the spectral characters released onto the political stage by children without voices of their own make for a play of impersonations, or better still, they turn the old categories of political life into roles that can be occupied by people of any age or gender. In itself, this is not a new phenomenon, since political representation too involves role-playing given its theatrical origins. But more apposite is the theater of devotion, in which a divine being not only takes human form, but is celebrated by believers who in turn take on the roles of those who had known such sacred figures. The Imitatio Christi is one example of this, where it is not only Jesus himself, but all those around him who become models for Christian emulation or identification. It is not accidental that the first such models are Mary, Joseph, and other adults who witnessed his birth and childhood. The same can be said for the commemoration of Imam Hussein's martyrdom with the Shia, a tragedy that is foreshadowed even in his childhood and includes children among its eventual victims. And then there is the story of Krishna, who not only plays at being a child, lover, and warrior, but encourages his devotees to perform the roles and feel the wonderment, passion, or joy of his foster mother, childhood friends, lovers, or disciples in a lila or blissful playing of the kind children are chiefly meant to enjoy. Children are crucial in all these practices of impersonation, in other words, whose identifications involve the switching of gender, generation, and other biographical characteristics. By enabling this form of impersonation, children in public life liberate political roles from biology in a way that the freedom or political inclusion of women, slaves, and others has never managed to do. Much more than mere empathy and far removed from political representation, such a play of roles involves not just temporary and ritualized forms of identification, but importantly, a disruption of temporality itself. Allowing for time travel, it takes the present into the past while projecting the latter into the future. And it is this shaking up of linear time that robs adults of the biological distinction upon which their political status is based, allowing women, children, and slaves to haunt the roles whose loss of biographical integrity have turned them into concepts or categories more faithful to political thought than the kind of citizenship that is still defined by free and adult males who belong to specific social groups. It is in such ways as these that children, along with all those who continue to lack political voice, nevertheless make a ghostly appearance in public life. In her reflections on graduating from Oxford in the midst of a pandemic, and therefore of being robbed, like all her peers, of a generational milestone different from the childhood she had once lost, Malala Yousafzai goes on to list the names of young women like herself who had as children also become activists in public life. Refusing their exceptionality by sheer dint of listing their growing numbers, Yousafzai is able to detach both children and therefore adults too from any biological fixity and even reverse their accepted roles in chiding the latter for their scant participation in political life. Quote, Lysipriya Kangujam was only 7 when she challenged politicians in India for their failure to enact climate change laws. 11-year-old Naomi Wadler quieted a crowd of thousands at the 2018 March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C., when she urged them to remember Black girls and women affected by gun violence. After her family fled Somalia's civil war, Hamdia Ahmed spent the first 7 years of her life in a refugee camp. By the time she was a teenager, she was campaigning for displaced people everywhere. And of course, there's my friend Greta Thunberg. I'm often asked to give advice to children, and I tell them, you don't have to wait to be an adult to be a leader. Young people are leading, but our world has too many problems for one generation to solve. So today, my advice is for our elders. It's not too late for you to change. Close quote. Instead of children having to wait to enter politics and behave like adults, then it is now adults who are told they still have the time to do so by imitating their own children. As with Hamlet, the ghost has taken precedence over the flesh and blood man who must now do his bidding by following the course of justice, morality, and sacrifice rather than self-interest. And in doing so, of course, the politics adults are asked to conduct departs from itself and turns into its opposite. So let me come to my conclusion. To my knowledge, Gandhi is the only modern thinker to have foregrounded the role of children in moral and, as a consequence, political life. And he did so precisely by attending to the child as a figure, much like the animal in this respect, which possesses no future in its own right. In his 1928 commentary on an ancient Sanskrit text called the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi argued that children and slaves represented ideal moral subjects. In doing so, of course, he overturned conventional notions of moral perfection, for which free and adult males were understood as subjects of this kind because of their independence, knowledge, and serious investment in shaping the future. But for Gandhi, these very characteristics were what disqualified men from exercising moral and even political agency, while admirably suiting children for it. It was precisely because children and slaves depended upon others, whether masters, parents, or teachers, that they could and indeed had to live in the present without any thought of making the future. This allowed them to grasp the present with far more gravity than adults, for whom it was always being sacrificed for some vision of the future in acts of instrumental violence that were nevertheless unable to achieve their aim with any certainty. And even if the future being planned in this way did end up coming about, Gandhi thought that it could never escape the violence of its birth, and in addition, brought along with it any number of unforeseen consequences which gave rise to new problems and so invariably undermined the moral and political foundation it was intended to provide. By pressing so assiduously to achieve only very specific ends, the violent instrumentality of politics was both idealistic and therefore eventually self-destructive. Children and slaves, however, by inhabiting the present more fully than others and giving their acts moral meaning in its terms, were unwilling to sacrifice the present for the future and instead able to do the reverse in prizing virtuous means over desired ends. And this meant that they left the future open to a number of possible ends whose goodness was guaranteed by the very virtue of their means. This, Gandhi thought, was a far more realistic and even pragmatic way of behaving, one that made place for the incalculable in political life, if only so as not to be destroyed by it. While he did not approve of slavery, of course, Gandhi paired slaves with children not only in a reference to their historical association, but very deliberately in order to turn the traditional idea of masculine independence on its head. His understanding of slavery as a form of experience leading to freedom also bears comparison to Hegel's famous passage on the master-slave dialectic in the Phenomenology of Spirit. There, too, it was the slave's laborious grappling with an obdurate world in the present that eventually allowed him to surpass what had become the master's purely ideal domination of it. But where Hegel's dialectic was nothing if not historical, seeking to push history into the future, for Gandhi, the present remained the site of moral action overshadowing politics. By focusing on the present in actions deprived of instrumentality, children and slaves were able to let the future emerge without trying to predetermine it in a violent idealism. And without this urge to make the future, violence exercised in the present could not be perpetuated in it. This made every moment of the future another present, as if in an instantiation of Bishop Berkeley's theory about the non-existence of the external world in a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge. Yet in a history made up of an innumerable series of presents, politics necessarily took second place to morality if it did not entirely wither away. Gandhi tied the future making of politics to what he called modern civilization, by which he meant a world defined by the addiction to consumption that characterized industrial capitalism. And he seemed to think that it could be halted by social relations organized along other lines. Let us take a closer look at Gandhi's ideal child, whom he most frequently described in the mythological figure of Prahlad. The son of a demon king who unsuccessfully subjected him to a variety of tortures because of his virtue, Prahlad eventually brought about his father's death by praying to Vishnu for deliverance. The king had received a boon which prevented him from being killed by man or beast, indoors or out, by day or night, or by anyone born of a woman. One dusk, while boasting of his invulnerability to Prahlad, the king kicked one of the pillars of his palace walls, daring Vishnu to appear. The pillars split open, and out of it emerged Vishnu as half man, half lion, and proceeded to tear the demon apart. Now, why would Gandhi choose this graphically violent story of a parricide as much as a deliverance to illustrate his ideal of childhood? The story of Prahlad is one of sacrifice, but unlike biblical and other monotheistic narratives in which it is the child who must be sacrificed by a parent, as in the story of Abraham and Isaac, here the situation is reversed. This makes the child into the primary moral agent rather than a potential, even if consenting, victim. Yet Prahlad doesn't actually perform the sacrifice himself or take any part in it. All he does is endure his father's torments and pray to Vishnu. In this way, he focuses entirely on virtuous deeds in the present and does not even consider the future that generally gives sacrifice its meaning. The fact that Vishnu appears at a moment of timelessness while occupying no particular place or species sets aside all the regular coordinates of human action. And this plays into Gandhi's vision of salvation as the incalculable element in moral and political life, one he often described as the incarnation of Vishnu on earth. Gandhi's ideas may well owe something to the cultural logic manifested in stories like that of Prahlad, which was well known to his Indian audience. But the emergence of children in contemporary politics, albeit outside its logic, also presents us with a kind of possibility that Gandhi had already espied in their name. For while in Iqbal Masih, Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and even Shamima Begum might push for a certain kind of adult future in old-fashioned political terms, they can only do so from a time and place beyond its instrumentality. And it has been their more or less inadvertent questioning of such a politics that, I have tried to show, has made them into global figures. Perhaps the Mahatma was right after all, and we can inherit the future primarily in moral terms, for which it is children who will have been our prophets. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for what has been a very inspired intervention. Before we open the floor to questions from both the faculty as well as students, as well as other audience members, I can't help but ask a brief two-part question of my own. While I was listening to you speak, I continuously was reminded of the South Asian colonial as well as the American civil rights imbued quality of your metaphor. Whether we look at Jim Crow nomenclature, literally denoting an adult Black person through words like boy or girl, or the rhetoric of the childlike effeminate Bengali Babu, I would like to believe that the childhood of politics has a childhood beyond 21st century presences like Thunberg and Yousafzai. In this light, while the idea of focusing on the political potential of juvenile presences is definitely insularly or microhistorically fascinating, I was wondering, firstly, to what extent you would agree that the temporal refraction of a global juvenile methodology would be forced to function on an archetypical understanding of the juvenile, and thereby position methodological viability on undesirably juvenile methodological lines, as well as, secondly, to the extent to which you would consider the placing of children in voiceless vis-a-vis exceptionality templates as presupposing the path towards a voice as something intrinsically tied to a very specific definition of adulthood, thereby bolstering an affect-laden reactiveness that makes nonsense of labels like the post-colonial.
Thanks very much. I haven't thought about the possibility of the, as it were, the nonsensical nature of post-colonialism. But of course, you're right in what you say about the metaphor of childhood or childishness in its racialized use in settler societies like the Americas and in colonized societies like that of like those of South Asia. And of course, what I try to do in this talk is to bring those histories, in particular the latter, to bear upon the contemporary emergence of children, in quotes, in political life. And what I was trying to suggest, as you gathered, was that in a way the figure of the child has become politically resonant and powerful in our own times, in part because it is the only remaining figure legally, juridically deprived of political life. Once upon a time, colonized subjects, women, slaves, etc., had been part of this much larger group. And they have all in various ways been lifted out of it, even if in a hierarchical manner, by, as you note, the assumption of voice. What does it mean then for the child, however defined, to remain the last such figure in a world in which politics has come to define liberation in general, no longer say religion? And what I've tried to suggest is that the figure of the child as a remnant of the past in some sense also gives it an extraordinary power, but it is a power that can only exist outside the political as normatively defined. So the talk was, of course, about how this, how the boundary is constantly being traversed, whether in the form of a ghost or a ghost from the past or a ghost from the future, and how that traversal puts into question all the other kinds of categories that we tend to take for granted. And what really interests me is the way in which these categories, even though they are notionally defined by biology, either gender, for instance, or age, tend increasingly to be deprived of these characteristics. The figure of the child, and indeed of childhood as we know, is historically defined and varies, and therefore, the traversal of this border between the political and the non-political, if you will, further renders these categories into forms of abstraction, because it now becomes possible to name the adult as being truly childish and the child as being more adult-like, etc. So I'm really interested in the way in which what we are seeing, what we might be seeing happening is the further reduction, if not disappearance, of the biological element, which had been so important in defining political maturity. What if we remove the biological element altogether, as it has notionally been removed when thinking about the entry of women into political life, or of non-white people into political life? What happens when the child, the last figure defined biologically, is removed or abstracted from biology? So I don't know about post-colonialism, but I think that one of the questions that I find interesting that I'm interested in asking is whether we can think about the emergence of political subjects without these biological and generational definitions that had previously defined them. How might that be possible? What would such a world look like? The other thing that interests me, of course, is that this idea of adulthood and childhood is itself quite modern. Probably doesn't go back to before the 18th century. And that even into the early 19th century, there is work on this about the United States. It was status that defined rank, and status that defined ability, and not age. So, you could have, as you had in South Asia, child marriages, right? And children being able to own property and all, and even dispose of property. So generational characteristics, and in that sense, biological characteristics, were not so long ago actually predicated upon status. They have emerged as universals, as you say, in very recent times. I would also argue, and this is work that I've done earlier in my career, that in a place like South Asia, for instance, the figure of the woman and the gendered gender also is not a universal category until modern times. And I've suggested as much by describing the way in which women, children, slaves, etc., not so long ago belonged in the same world. They belonged together, and therefore they shared characteristics in common.
Thank you very much, sir. I mean, I'll definitely be thinking about what you said regarding the intersectionality of categorical abstraction vis-a-vis biology. I'd now like to take this moment to invite any other further questions from the faculty as well as other students and audience members. The floor is open to questions. I think Mridu ma'am has a question. Mridu ma'am, please go ahead.
Hi, Faisal. Good to see
Hi,
you.
Mridu, so nice to see you.
Likewise, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. As usual, you have my head going in all kinds of different directions, and I don't really quite know where to begin, sort of asking questions that really emerge from curiosity. So let me begin with the remarks that you made towards the end when you were referring to Gandhi and his choice of the ideal child being Prahlad. And what I was intrigued by was that you also suggested that, of course, Prahlad himself doesn't conduct the sacrifice, sorry, I think your words were that he endures his father's tortures and what's it called, and prays to Vishnu. So I'm intrigued because I wonder whether, I mean, Gandhi is not really talking about a child, right, or the child in politics. He's talking about adults in politics. So in that sense, I mean, couldn't one, I mean, when I was hearing you, I kept thinking, perhaps because I'm a little suspicious all the time whenever I hear Gandhi's moral register. I mean, I can't help but place him in the context of the politics that he was so much a part of, right? Can we not see then Gandhi's choice of Prahlad as the also, the embodiment of the kind of politics he'd like to see that does not sacrifice, as you said, the present for the future, and so on and so forth, as in fact an attempt by Gandhi to remove agency from the various, from a whole bunch of groups who are also acting politically in the times in which he lives and functions politically. So, I mean, in some ways, I would have, I mean, just from hearing you, I mean, it struck me as, as he speaking of certain other groups. Because I also remember, I mean, Gandhi, for instance, when he's dealing with the Harijan movement, right? Remember, he keeps, in the context of the Bihar earthquake, he says the earthquake was visited for the sins of untouchability and everyone must repent very cruelly, including the Harijans of Bihar, right? But then he also turns around and he says, but you must not perform the price check. Those who know better must perform it for you. So, I mean, I read Gandhi as someone who also deliberately removes agency. And just in that context, when you were talking about, the more active child figures, Greta Thunberg and Malala Yousafzai, etc., you use the word impersonation. But if the politics, and I think you said that towards the end, your concluding remarks, if the politics are really framed by adults who are thinking of the future, sacrificing the present for it, then couldn't one substitute impersonation for ventriloquizing, adults ventriloquizing through children? Sorry, so those are, I don't know if they're questions, but they're a little just provoked by the excellent remarks. Thanks, Faisal.
Yeah, thanks, Mridu. No, you're right, that Gandhi, in a way, what he's suggesting, I should have been more clear about this, is in a way, it's a cancellation of the political.
Yeah.
His privileging of the child and the slave in this way, clearly hugely problematic, though I tried to suggest why it was that the slave became this is from his commentary on the Gita, and he hastens to add that, of course, he doesn't recommend slavery, nevertheless. So in a way, the child and the slave figure as moral subjects rather than political subjects. But for him, it is these moral subjects that have the most, as it were, outside the political realm, have the most effect on politics itself, much more so than those who practice politics, precisely because they can live in the present and focus in the present and deploy virtuous means in the present without considering future ends. And in this way, they open up the future and make it incalculable for a series of, his argument is that in our desire to shape the future, first of all, we can't really do that. It's a hubristic desire. Secondly, even if we do accomplish it, we are often faced by, as it were, blowback, unintended consequences. But if we don't seek to shape the future in this way, if we simply dedicate ourselves to living virtuously in the present, what we do is leave many more numerous ends, possible ends open, virtuous possible ends.
What I find,
rather than determining.
What I find frightening about that is that, of course, he's Harijan, for instance, the term itself is infantilizing, right? I mean, child of Hari, of Vishnu, the children, because as he's working out these ideas and and he's always interesting, creating the ideal moral personality, he's also engaged, and he knows that there are, there's an Ambedkar who's engaged in the very, very real politics that confront, Dalit groups, right? When Gandhi says, do not sacrifice, pray, someone else will do the sacrificing for you, right? Isn't that a removal of agency? When he launches his Harijan movement, isn't he actually saying, well, I'll act on your behalf, right?
I suppose it's in part because he thinks that it is upper castes who bear this responsibility, who need to perform the sacrifice. Now, you're right that in doing so, he whether consciously or inadvertently infantilizes Dalits. But this is his reasoning, and it's a reasoning that remains the same for whichever group he talks about, because he's very, even though he is a thinker of sacrifice, he's actually astounded and taken aback by and fearful of what he thinks is the inappropriate rush to sacrifice, because he thinks it should only be the final stage. You shouldn't, because otherwise it becomes coercive. Now, of course, you could argue that Gandhi's the famous fast unto death that resulted in the Pune Pact is also coercive. So he's not free of these threats. But the thing about childhood in Gandhi is very interesting, because he often himself was described as childlike, and he behaved in that manner. He was compared himself to Mickey Mouse, no childish figure, but also he's very intent on, he's after all named after the child god, Mohan Das, the slave of the child god, right? But, also when he writes his autobiography and other texts, he insists that nonviolence and everything he preaches can only be meaningful if even a child can grasp it, if even a child can act according to it. So and I think one reason why he is so, it's not simply a desire for universality, it's because he is intent on criticizing the conventional idea of politics, which depends, as I suggested in my talk, on the idea of language and responsibility. Because he understands that, and from what you've been saying, he also falsely demonstrates it in his own life, that language which defines maturity and which defines freedom is actually an remarkably exclusive category. Because in previous times and places, entire classes of people, genders, etc., been denied because they have no language, they cannot be heard, and all the rest. So for Gandhi, you cannot make that the defining characteristic. So he's really keen that children and women, in particular. But how do you do that without simply saying, okay, everyone has voice? you know, because
that's equally false.
it's not enough. It's not enough to say so. And so one of the things he does is very interesting. He's very suspicious of voice. You know, already in Hind Swaraj in 1909, he inveighs against parliamentary democracy and debate because he thinks that these are just forms of rehearsed speech that are partisan in all senses. And people actually lose their voice in politics. They don't gain any voice because, you know, members of parliament have to act according to what their party tells them. Newspapers support the parties that they support. People are fooled. So language is actually a site of betrayal and dissimulation. It's not a transparent.
Obfuscation.
Which is why Gandhi is also so keen on silence. You know, he has the days of silence and all the rest. So for him, the figure of voicelessness is actually typical of Gandhi. He places all the agential weight on the weakest figures in society. But that's also interesting, right? So, you know, children are to be, the voiceless are to be the agents, the peasants, etc. But not simply by claiming something that the powerful already have, because he understands that that is not really a workable solution. So when, for instance, he talks about animals, and I suggest in my lecture that, you know, children and animals can also sometimes be paired in this, you know, they live purely in the present. You know, it's precisely because there is no relationship between human beings and animals of language, which is the thing that defines humanity, right? That is a purely moral relationship. Because, you know, the onus or the sacrifice of the weight is on the human. Even if you don't understand what an animal feels or thinks, you still have responsibilities towards it. And therefore, there's a relationship there. So it's as you say, Mritu, with Gandhi, everything is always ambiguous because it can go in either direction. But he allows you to think, I think, quite interestingly about this.
That is interesting, actually. Absolutely. Thanks, Faisal. Thanks.
Hi, thanks. Thank you, Salim. Hello, Professor Devji. Thank you for a splendid talk. It was making me think of many things, particularly because I work on children, I work in childhood, and the relationship of missionary women who worked with their child wards in Bengal and Bihar in the 1890s. And I was thinking of something in relation to what you said about the biological element sort of gradually vanishing from these kind of, in a context like this. So there is a precedent of children who are active moral subjects, if you look at missionary literature, because a lot of missionary women, when they're writing, they're publishing their journals, they're writing about Indian children, mostly Hindus and Muslims, who are apostates and who reject their own kin, and they're dying in the process unless they're allowed to convert to Christianity, and so on and so forth. And to connect with what Midhu said, a lot of them also seem to be showing a tendency for sacrifice and mobilizing an entire republic of Christian children across the world who are also learning to sacrifice, and so on and so forth. And really, a lot of juvenile missionary periodicals kind of cover this kind of sort of children in agentive roles. But I was also wondering that as much as the biological element becomes less important, in the sense that these children are less infantile, the peculiarity of their generational location does not go away. Rather, I think there's also this implicit understanding that children are also, if they're moral subjects, they are moral subjects temporarily for now. And even if a republic, a Christian republic, were to be forged with children from Sivan to Cornwall sending letters, photographs, gifts, it's only going to be till they're 13. So this is what I wanted to draw attention to a little bit, that maybe even if the biological element fades in as much as this infantilized, dumbed down, protected child sort of recedes. But in many ways, the child, if you're still thinking about a child who can reach out and whose actions can have ramifications, you're thinking about a child who's not completely racialized and who's still work in progress. In that sense, it's like a pie which has not completely set, to use a very bad analogy. So the generational location does not really, I mean, it's still very, very remarkable, which makes the child so potent. I thought, but it's difficult for me to think of Greta Thunberg maybe in those terms. Will she lose her potency? Will it run out of steam? Is that how she's seen? That 10 years from now, and she's nobody, or her voice is not so much of a voice, it doesn't count as much. So yeah, that is.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really fascinating. And, it speaks to one of the points I tried to make on how actually, when you think of religion, has traditionally offered us other ways in which we can think about figures such as children or women, or, and other ideas of freedom or liberation. And when I'm reminded, for instance, of, Sudeepa Kaviraj often notes how a term like mukti, liberation, which had been a term of purely salvific importance, of religious importance, with the emergence of the Mukti Bahini with the freedom of Bangladesh, that term becomes political in a quite new way, he argues. So, there are historical instances in which this switch happens, and what remains of that older term is very, very interesting. How freedom retains a history which is not necessarily a political history. But in what you are saying, I think what's absolutely fascinating is that more than Thunberg, it's one of the quotes that I read out from Malala Yousafzai, where she's speaking of all of these other. It's like she's graduated, and she's now handing over to her younger, women, young girls, I should say, successors. It's almost that she has understood that she can no longer play this role, and in a way, it's such a nice inversion of the conventional political idea of that you must wait until you're mature enough to become a political subject. Here it is, you already are one of some kind, and you will cease being one after a certain point.
And you pass on the baton, right?
Exactly, yeah. So that there's a kind of narrow band,
right?
However it is that you define childhood or youth. That it is adulthood that disqualifies you in a way, and that it's childhood, whether biologically defined or not, that allows you to speak in this fashion. So I think that it's a beautiful, if you will, inversion that's going on there. And with the idea of a child republic, I mean, I mentioned the Children's Crusade only in passing, but there too you have, in medieval times, of course, this idea that the child can speak for and act in the place of the adult more effectively.
Right.
But a lot of this, of course, falls into those, and I spent a lot of time rehearsing this, what does it mean? The child's power comes from his or her deprivation of politics, and yet, so does it simply ghost is it simply the ghost of its own future? Is it enacting its future adulthood in the present, or is it simply what Mridu was saying, being ventriloquized by an adult?
Right.
An adult is the ghost. So all of these things continuously come up when we think of children in public life. But no, I think that's very nice that the link between a Christian, I mean, of course, the idea of a Respublica Christiana is an old Christian idea.
Right.
Anyway, so a republic of children, and how that nicely mirrors or contrasts or inverts the kind of post-18th century and liberal idea of the adult republic. I think it should make us think, and make me think more seriously about what remains, and what remains connected to what we take to be the political from that inheritor from that other world. It might not be so cut and dried as I have suggested. So
no, it wasn't. But thank you very much.
Sujata, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I am audible, right, sir?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you for the lecture, sir. Really wonderful reflections. My question is actually a kind of like linked to the previous question that was asked. Um, I had read this article, which was by Bertrand Russell. It was titled "The Superior Virtue of the Oppressed," where he talks about how children are considered this kind of superior being with this uninterrupted moral compass. However, at the same time, the other end of the discourse also exists, that children at the same time are capable of being misguided morally and hence have to be molded in a particular manner. But you, as you noted in the last question, that when you become an adult, you are like disqualified from this kind of uninterrupted moral compass. It's an assumption that you have certain quote unquote rational considerations that you have to undertake before those moral considerations. So what happens is that when the child is still a child, it's taken that they have that moral compass, and when they grow up, they do not have it anymore. And since we think that the whole narrative surrounding the child is one of the future, that you are a child and you will become a future responsible citizen, a future social being, whatever you call it. So my question is simple. Do you think at any time there is a possibility of this discourse or this narrative arising that we will stop fighting for the future because historically, whatever present has molded itself into the future, we have changed. But more importantly, the moment we talk about the future, we are talking about a time and space where we as children, let's say, will become beings who are morally corrupted or who are more bound and less liberated by moral, like by material and rational concerns. And hence we are like this censored voice, something which I think is slightly represented by Greta Thunberg as a comment, like Caesar recently commented, as Greta Thunberg is someone who does not want to have a dialogue. She says that we have had enough of dialogues, now let's change, which means there's a like greater attention towards the present. So do you think at any moment the possibility of such a discourse exists given this realization?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, you're right that even though in Western Europe and in modern times, the moral character of childhood is often said to reside in its innocence and therefore its closeness to some ethical origin or authenticity. The reverse, of course, is also true. So it becomes a kind of indefinable point because there's a certain freedom to childhood. Also, the child cannot be held responsible because they're not adults. And as you suggest, therefore, the adult is a much more guarded figure and all the rest. So, part of this this range of ambiguous, always ambiguous and somewhat contradictory definitions, where you can look at its innocence at on one side and its irresponsibility on the other. These ideas come out of a kind of psychic economy almost, and all the characteristics that are imputed to children can also be imputed to adults in various ways. So again, it brings me back to one of the points I was trying to make, that actually it is almost impossible to make a hard and fast distinction between childhood and adulthood. Now, whether it is for the purpose of returning to the proclaimed innocence or authenticity, moral authenticity of the child, or of leaving that behind and assuming the responsibilities of an adult. But what you are suggesting, I take as being what I think Gandhi would have suggested, that we should in fact not concern ourselves with the future. And for him, that is the teaching of the Gita, Nishkam Karma, that you must, because desire is often the desire for the fruits of the action, so therefore for the future. Now, whether this inevitably puts him within the remit of a certain kind of thinking of childhood is not entirely clear. Of course, he does, as I said, talk glowingly about children and slaves and this connection, but he doesn't really metaphorize childhood beyond that in the commentary on the Gita anyway. One could do it for him, as it were. But I'm sorry, it's a set of disjointed responses to your question, but only to suggest that, yes, there might be a possibility of thinking about the present rather than the future, but to do so would be to resign the role in making the future that has classically defined politics, and therefore to resign instrumentality. So it would be to reinforce the distinction between the moral and the political, which is what Gandhi seems to want to do, while at the same time saying that the moral actually, ironically or paradoxically, gives you more, as it were, bang for your buck than the political. That your moral actions will have more political consequences in the future it seeks not to determine. It has the potential of being far more consequential than the instrumentality of politics. So it's again an ambiguous kind of statement that you can actually give up politics. You don't need it because moral life can actually have huge consequences for the future without ever trying to define it, as it were, preemptively. So in a way, it seems to be a kind of advocacy of the possibility of dispensing with the political in its modern consideration altogether, not in order to live in a utopia, but to suggest that moral life can actually encompass what politics is meant to do without adopting its instrumentality. So in that sense, yes, I think it allows Gandhi not simply to privilege one sphere over the other, morality versus politics, but to actually conceive of doing away with the latter altogether. Of course, he never says it because he understands that there are always people who will be instrumental. But he suggests its possibility, which is what I take you to be doing as well. And is it possible to think this, even if it's not historically possible?
Okay, anyone else? Shomenda?
No, thank you. I'm still soaking in, Faisal. Thanks for the wonderful lecture. I was only kind of, trying to see to what extent this is also actually embracing. This is not so much a question. I'm sorry if it is more like a comment. To what extent is this kind of, anticipating the yet to become adult and adulthood, embracing that adulthood that is not yet out there, the moment has not yet arrived. To what extent it is this, or whether or not this is more the kind of, privileging of the present in the way Koselleck privileges the idea of the present in futures past. A future that is already past, that is your present, to kind of, celebrate the present and make the virtue of that in a more philosophical way.
Yes, because of course, carpe diem and celebrating the present has normally been thought of as an immoral act because you have no concern for the future and it's about pleasure. And again, this is one of the wacky things about Gandhi is that he almost deliberately and purposefully takes things that have negative connotations and make positive things out of them, and vice versa. And it's almost like he's constantly conducting a set of thought experiments. And as you know, experiment is a term that he's very fond of and uses for his own autobiography. So there's a kind of experimental thinking that's going on in Gandhi, in his texts and his actions. But going back to your first point, Showman, it's all the figures apart from Gandhi I dealt with in this talk are figures who don't necessarily explicitly repudiate these categories of adulthood and childhood. But they certainly submit them to intense questioning. And even as they don't repudiate them, their very transgression of the boundaries between, for instance, childhood and adulthood allows them a certain kind of power and freedom. So, which is why I suggest that they keep going back and forth, that they open up possibilities which they do not themselves necessarily theorize or vocalize, precisely because they depend upon them at the same time. And this gets back to my concern with Gandhi, in that the very Thunberg and the Yousafzai, etc., who want to affect change in future through adults, in this sense, they are the ghosts that are haunting the adult present, must do so by constantly proclaiming their own childhood. We as children, even though we are children, we can do this or say this. So, they both reaffirm while transgressing at the same time. So they're constantly moving back and forth across that border. And it's that possibility that I found really interesting. So they don't themselves necessarily draw the logic of it out. They don't need to, because that is not their intent. But by rehearsing this back and forth movement, they allow us to reconsider what these generational categories, what has happened to them, what is happening to them, and what they might come to mean. Because as they make this, they traverse that border back and forth, the biological characteristics of the generation are slowly or quickly being attenuated. And there's a kind of questioning on both sides. And what I'm describing is spectrality or ghostliness after Derrida. So I think that that is what fascinated me. The first thing that I was interested in is, why do we seem to see in our own day so many, as it were, children in public life globally, who become, as it were, globally known figures? They're not just, people who are known in neighborhoods or whatever. And they have specifically political roles. So they are no longer necessarily, if at all, deploying the kind of religious register that children, as Ahia was describing, for instance, that children might have in the past, even in the more recent past. They could. It's not like such a thing is impossible. But in the cases that I mentioned, maybe Shamima Begum, the so-called jihadi bride, because there is a specifically religious, and I'll have to think more about that role that she's playing. But otherwise, they are not. They are playing roles or ghosting them that are otherwise known, except they're doing so by making use of what I'm calling a kind of a non-political sighting, that of childhood. So that is the question that I started out with. Why are we seeing the Malalas and the Gretas and all of these people around? What's happening? And secondly, could it be said that the very marginalization of children as the only figures now left who are ostentatiously placed outside politics, who are ostentatiously deprived of political agency, they cannot vote, etc. Is it that very marginalization that actually allows them paradoxically to speak with so much more power? So that was the paradox that I was interested in.
No, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, and as I tried to suggest, they nevertheless cannot do without constantly signaling or reminding us of the other figures like women who had once been part of this world alongside children and slaves, etc., colonized people, whatever racial groups. There's a kind of talk about ghostly, there's a kind of ghostly re-invocation of that older world in which only adult males of certain groups could exercise formal political voice and no one else could. and when children act in this manner, they bring to mind those other figures who are now ostensibly on the other side with men, right? Who are supposedly endowed with political voice. So again, there's a kind of both in the present, but also the invocation of the past, the re-invoking of these older, it's like what are those meetings when you go to your old, reunion, like a reunion, a school reunion, of people who all used to be together in one group and who no longer are together. And I think what the reunion allows us to see today is that these apparently, what I was saying in response to another question earlier, these apparently universal categories such as gender, or better still sex, or generation, adulthood and childhood, we probably shouldn't read them back to before the 19th or 18th centuries. That there was a sense in which, my work on colonial India, for instance, I see if you look at the Urdu language and text in the Urdu language, it's not until the middle to late 19th century that women actually emerge as independent subjects. I don't mean independent in the sense that they can speak in their own name, that as objects of male discourse, as completely separate from children, separate from servants, separate from, when you look at the reformist texts, which are all about educating women and things like that, the problem for the male reformer is that these women are too embedded in these social networks with children, with servants, with others. They need to be removed from those networks. So children need to be sent to boarding school so they escape the evil influence of women. Right? Women need to be separated from servants, so they must be educated so they can do their own accounts and manage their servants with the appropriate distance. They should not be too close to servants. So that they should be removed from the evil influence of servants. And in this way, the Muslim woman emerges as a figure in her own right. I mean, now you see Tagore doing that in The Home and the World, for instance, to some, it's a somewhat equivalent story happening there, where the woman is created for the husband or for the man as a gendered being separated out from all the others. So I suspect something similar is happening with generation, because as I was saying, there was a time when child marriages and all of these things were possible. So some form of, as it was, sexual life and other forms of disposal of property were possible even for children of certain status. So I might say that it was rank and status that might have defined. It's not that gender didn't exist as, that women didn't exist as a category, obviously, just as men did. But they were defined in terms of rank rather than universally in their own right as a single group of people. And the same possibly could have been said for men, that there's no singular idea of masculinity. So that is the paper I gave today is not historical in that sense, but in my head anyway, it's these kinds of thoughts that I have been thinking about.
No, absolutely. I agree. I mean, this is not only the question of, gender and sex and the question of biology, and this is a generation, and also the whether or not they are universal categories and whether or not you are looking at in this long direct processes, they're also very context specific, depending on what culture you are even talking about. What are the vernacular idioms? English is one among several other languages that we can possibly talk about. And that is what we are conversing in at the moment. But what about categories of Vatsalya, for instance? What are the different variations in different literary genres? Yes, absolutely agreed. I mean, also very context specific, depending on what you are looking at. Yes, but fascinating, very interesting. Thank you.
Sir, we should not get you tired, but one of our few participants raised their hands to have their queries. Ananda Rupa, please. Are
Thank
you
you,
there?
sir. Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much, sir, for the lecture. Sir, in your speech, you talked about three names of Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and Cecilia Kankar. So, sir, all three of them had one thing in common, which is supportive parents or supportive families. Unlike most people in Indian households or in Indian middle class households, where parents expect their children to be exact replica or clone of themselves, where parents, if the parents have bigoted views, they will expect their children to hold the same views, or they think that politics is a taboo or a dangerous or an inherently evil thing that children should be kept away from. So which prevents the children from reading books or getting radicalized by themselves and ending up becoming what their parents want them to be, which is exact replica of themselves, and the vast amount of age shaming that exists in Indian households. So three arguments that I have come across that is given by Indian parents to keep their children away from politics is number one, that it's the very selfish neoliberal way of thinking that you owe nothing to the world. You just need to look for yourself. And like politics is not something you should care about. Just do what you're supposed to do. And the other thing is people like Greta have the privilege, or they are from comparatively developed nations, or she has the financial privilege of compromising with her studies so that she can engage with politics. And the third argument I come across is that if you do not engage with politics right now, and if you just look for yourself and then do a job in the future, then you can do better for your country, or you can do better, you can achieve your goal in a better way of social justice. So my question is, how do I counter these arguments, and what do you think children in such households should do to educate themselves about politics and becoming more political? Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I don't know if I can presume to advise you on that, but you're right, of course, that in the case, at least of two or three of these figures whom I dealt with, they did have supportive parents, incredibly supportive parents. In the case of Malala, of course, the parents there have also been accused, but typically of ventriloquizing, as Mridu was describing it, their own ambitions through their children. So there's also a kind of malign rhetorical move that is often made and is always made with children, that they are in fact being groomed or controlled by adults, either for purposes of fame and wealth, or for psychic reasons, that the adults could not do something in their own lives and they're working through their children. Yes, so that is true. But there are other figures. So Iqbal Masih, was sold into slavery, indentured by his parents at the age of 4 because they had a debt. And Shamima Begum, of course, really broke with her family to escape with the two of her friends to Syria and join ISIS, and she was a young teenager. So, at least a couple of those instances, there is no support. So, you have two kinds of, and even when there is no support, as in the case with Shamima Begum, she's said to have been groomed by others. So she's moved from her parents' influence, apparently, to the influence of, militants and terrorists, etc. So, they nicely represent the two ways in which children are seen as entering public life, either through or controlled by or given liberty by their parents, or against their wishes. And in India, it's true, as you say, but it's not just in India. I mean, these are arguments that are made everywhere, to my knowledge. And they are familiar because they have been made even in the days of the Indian independence movement, to return to Gandhi, who advised students to leave colleges and all the rest during the non-cooperation movement, much to the horror of their parents, who were worried about their future careers and all the rest. So the important thing about this, for me, is that this is another debate about the present versus the future. Right? What you say the parents are saying is you must wait, be educated, be self-sufficient, then you can do what you need to do. So it's a kind of deferred logic of deferral, which is very similar to the logic of a deferral that the colonial state used to deploy, and which Gandhi criticized, in which Indians, for instance, were told, you're not yet ready for independence, you must wait until you're properly trained up for it, and then we, the British, will give it to you. So the logic of deferral to the future is a very standard, almost cliched form. And then the child or the student's own logic might be, of course, one of the present, that there's a certain urgency to the present, that they need to participate in public life now and not in the future. So again, all I can say is that the options you described rehearse the kinds of temporally defined narratives and arguments that are familiar. And I need not advise you on what to do or not to do, because of course, Indian history has many such instances of these kinds of issues and problems. Obviously, the parents want to protect their children, and just as obviously the children might feel that they don't need protecting. So it's a classic family problem that can only be dealt with individually.
So we would not take more time from you. Perhaps here some queries, because she raised her hand. Here?
Is it all right to ask? I hate to be the one doing two questions. Only if you're not too tired, Professor Devji, or else I can...
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I was just wondering, when you were talking to Shomin, that you were asking why we hear of these child figures in public spaces now and not before. And I was trying to remember what were the avatars in which we saw children in public spaces before. And when I was growing up, I think till 5th grade, it was largely child prodigies, especially in Bengal, Ahmedabad. You would hear of children who could point any place on the map or do math in their head. And then in the late 90s, it became whiz kids. Everybody who was an IT genius at age 8 or 8+. And I sort of went back to what you said about children as prophets. And I hate to sort of make the insinuation and gesture elsewhere, but I was also wondering if these children in public spaces now are also, apart from being what they are also hermeneutic signposts for the time itself, for the nature of politics itself, because you don't just explode into the public horizon as a voice, right? The voice also has to be made in some way. So I was wondering if this was implicit in your work, but I was wondering if it says what it says about the nature of politics now.
Yes, no, you're right. I mean, that's exactly what interested me in this subject. Like, why do we see these figures and what it tells us about our own times? And, the easy answer would be to say social media, globalization, all of this stuff. And no doubt those are all true, but they don't really tell us anything. So I want, and therefore I tried to think, hopefully more deeply about the idea of the political itself and what it calls for, and how it is defined by adulthood, and how these, whatever their intents or motives, these self-proclaimed children, because they're also proclaiming themselves as children, not as adults, what their actions and their proclamations actually, what effect they have on the idea of the political, and how they make us rethink it, perhaps. So inadvertently. But I haven't come down to a more structural explanation for why now and why, apart from the explanations I've given so far have to do with the figure of the child being the last remaining figure, ostentatiously deprived. But of course, that has been the case for a while now, so it doesn't characterize only our times. So that is no doubt part of the, at least in my view, part of the explanation of the power they exercise, their very, supposed marginality. but it doesn't tell us much structurally about the conditions of our time. Of course, our time, there's a kind of sense of urgency, especially about things like climate change. But again, there have been such moments of urgency in the past. And I mentioned, the Cold War period of nuclear standoff, which is also existentially fraught, in terms of the survival of the world, nothing short of that. So I will have to think more closely about that. But it's interesting you mentioned these in the Indian context, and I don't think it's only in the Indian context. Perhaps the Indian context is more fixed upon child achievements, and you see this even if you were to look at, in America they have these things called spelling bees, these little competitions, and invariably Indian children win, so and you can see why, because they come out of this culture of child geniuses and all the rest, and it's almost like there's a striving either by themselves and or by their parents to present the child in public life. The kind of ambition, and again, it's not accidental, because children, it's happened to me as well, kind of brought up reading those Guinness Book of World Record, looking at stuff like that, the word Limca book or whatever it was, of record. So there is clearly a kind of a world, publishing consumerism, that shapes these kinds of desires for public expression and for feats of various kinds. And some of those feats, like in books of world records, can be accomplished by children. And they're even more astounding if they're accomplished by children. So there is certainly that. Now, how that might be linked to an older world in which children are also laboring, as Balmasi continue to labor, or are used in various kinds of, you still have it in India, child beggars, and, that they engage in, as it were, apparently adult life because they're earning money, but they're earning money precisely for being children. So again, there's a nice example of the way in which there's a straddling of both those worlds, which puts them both into question. So yes, only a set of comments to acknowledge what you have said, and to acknowledge also that I haven't come up with any structural explanation as to why in our day you see these figures, apart from social media, etc.
Just wanted to add very quickly, you were talking about an older world, and another place that it strikes you is, when these traditions of speaking of saintly figures and how their enlightenment comes at a very young age, right? You keep hearing about bhakti saints and there's so many stories of how, including, as you said, Krishna as Mohan, right? All kinds of feats in the spiritual domain that really come at that early age. So those stories are rife as well. And then you have, of course, the child warriors, the tragic side of the childhood used, right? In some ways. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's why the kind of religious dimension I mentioned, because it offers other ways of thinking about, as I said, liberation, freedom, and power. Maybe it's still more available in India than it is in, Europe. But I've always been struck by what's interesting about the child Krishna, for instance, is that there's this interplay between does he know or doesn't he know about himself? Arshia Sattar argues in her book on Rama that Rama is the only figure who doesn't know his own divinity, who suffers as a human being suffers, and therefore he is the ideal man, because he cannot separate himself from his persona as a husband, as a father, and the sacrifice, to say nothing of the sacrifice of Sita herself, of course. But so whereas Krishna is very interesting, because all of those Vishwarupa points in his career, where he's eating the butter and his Yashoda, makes him open his mouth and she sees the universe and all that. It's extraordinary because it brings together the kind of naughtiness and the innocence, as it were. Innocence is the wrong word, of childhood.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly he's an adult who is struck, but it's not clear whether the child still ceases to be a child and becomes, it's only on the Gita, on the field of Kurukshetra, when he reveals himself to Arjuna that that's a fully conscious, whereas otherwise there's a play, with the serpent, where he's vanquishing the serpent. He's playing at the same time. It's a great, it's a child play. So that I find really fascinating, that the way in which childhood is defined.
Can I just leave you? I promise I'll turn my camera off after this, but just a very scary thought in your head. Forgive me for it, but we're talking about Bal Krishna, and of course, immediately what's running through my head are those god-awful stories celebrating another Bal Narendra. And that's all I'll say on that one. Sorry. Thanks very much.
We have already running ahead of time.
Thank you very much.
And Professor Devji, you have always illuminated us. Thank you so much, sir. And you really deserve our thanks for accepting our invitation and delivering the lecture. And thanks a lot, sir, for taking out time from this busy schedule and enlightening us with the knowledge. May I request to Oritra for the vote of thanks?
Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank our guest, Professor Faisal Devji, for enlightening us with his knowledge. Today's lecture was full of knowledge and interesting things. It gave deep insights into the topic and also revealed some interesting facts. I am pretty sure the precious knowledge that Professor Devji gave us will definitely help us in our studies in the future. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Devji for taking out time from his busy schedule and enlightening us with his insightful talks. Thank you so much, sir. I would also like to thank our head of the department, Dr. Salim Javed, for giving permission to organize this lecture and inviting Professor Devji. I want to thank Dr. Shaumen Mukherjee and Professor Mridu Rai, and also the other members of the committee who really worked hard to make this event successful. Also, thank you to all students and faculties of Presidency University and other universities and colleges in and outside Bengal present here for making this event successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, sir. Hope you will meet again, not in virtually, physically, Presidency. In near future.
I'd like that very much. Calcutta is one of my favorite cities, so I much look forward to it.
Yeah, definitely, sir. Definitely we will meet. Thank you so much, sir. Once again.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I hate to say something just after the vote of thanks.